and it is roosting all through that area. Now, we don't know exactly where it goes to forage, because that wasn't part of our study. We didn't have funding to do that. But this is the bat that we do know from analyzing fecal pellets, that it is consuming agricultural pests. So it is foraging out over the ag lands. We don't know how far away from the rivers, but based on its diet, that's what it's doing. This is from I hope, a soon-to-be completed thesis. The student finished gathering the data a couple of years ago, but once they go off and get a 40-hour, 60-hour-a-week job, the thesis becomes secondary, and he hasn't written it up yet. But what you have also in this same area of Bear Creek, Black Creek, and the Raisin River is you have the 3 species of Myotis, the genus Myotis. You have the northern long-eared bat, which is proposed for listing as endangered. You have the little brown bat, which is proposed for listing as endangered, and you do have the federally listed Indiana bat. All right, so the symbols might be a little hard, but there's a lot of flags around here. The flags are the roost trees that we identified of the northern long-eared bat. Diamonds are Indiana bats. You can see one there. There are more of them out there, but we had one landowner in particular that was adamant that we could not go on the property, but the bats seemed to like that property. So we didn't find a lot of the roost trees of the Indiana bat. And then there's a couple of plus signs over here, Wilson's barn, Sheldon's barn over there, where we had colonies of over 100 little brown bats. I find this area to be, in terms of diversity of bats, one of the most intriguing and important in the state of Michigan, because I have caught every species that we should have caught in the state of Michigan in those drainages. The only one out of the 9 that we have not caught is the eastern pipistrelle. That bat has just recently, in the last 35 years, invaded the lower peninsula from the southwest, and it's gradually expanding across the state. If I had given this talk last year, I would have said there's no way that it is in Lenawee County. But we did pick up one in Washtenaw County last September. It was turned in for rabies testing. So there was one in Washtenaw County just north of here. That means that it is possible that all 9 species that live in the state live in this particular area. Well, some of you might have seen this. This is a little movie clip that was done with thermal imaging cameras. So it's relying on the temperatures of the animals to create the image. And that was a bat that came in from the side and then met its end. I entitled it Bat Golf. Anyway, you want it again?
Yeah.
You can go online and find it.
Yeah, where is it?
Well, I'm not sure where. This was done by, yeah, it comes in from the lower left. It was done by Jason Horn. He was a graduate student at Boston University at the time. That's actually my alma mater for my PhD. So, that can happen. Bats can die. You can have collisions with the rotors. The amount of this mortality can be very high. And this is the example that's almost always thrown out there, the Mountaineer Wind Energy Center. I think that was in West Virginia. But the upshot was that in this brief time period from the 31st of July to the 11th of September, they documented potentially up to about 2,000 animals being killed in that short period of time. There's another wind farm in Wisconsin that recently got up and running, something like Greenfield's Blue Sky, I think that's what they call it. And it has documented something in the area between 40 and 50 annual deaths per turbine, and there are 82 turbines in the wind farm. Between 40 and 50 annually per turbine, and I believe there's 82 turbines in that wind farm. And you can find that report online too, I found it. The point is that you have a large number of bats that potentially can be killed. Why is that a problem? Because you have long lives and low reproductive rates. And on top of that, you have white nose syndrome and introduced disease. You put all of these things together, and it's going to be very difficult for bats to overcome large amounts of mortality like this. Now, we can't absolutely tell you that that is a horrible, horrible thing. I mean, it sounds horrible to me. We don't know the absolute size of bat populations. No one does. There's no way to determine the absolute size. So if you're killing, well, anyway, let's go to the next one. There was an estimate then, based upon, this was published about 2 years ago, And based upon the published data from post-construction surveys at wind farms and the projected amount of wind energy that would be introduced into the mid-Atlantic region, so I believe that's Virginia, West Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania, the estimate that they came up with for the year 2020 was that there would be up to 110,000 bat deaths per year. You see, so it's not just one wind farm. You also have to consider that there's other wind farms. And all of those can add up to large numbers. Unfortunately, we can't tell you, is that 1%, 10%, 50% of the population? We don't know, because we don't know with most of our bats how many of them are actually out there. Well, I showed you the collision thing, and that's a standard way of dying, especially for birds. But in reality, bats have another way in which they die at wind farms, and it's called barotrauma. It's essentially a decompression phenomenon. So those turbine blades are potentially moving up to about 190 miles per hour. It'll vary, of course, with wind speed and the size of the rotors. They don't look like they're going that fast because it's such a huge, massive structure. But they can move that fast. And something moving at such speeds leaves behind what's called a low pressure vortex. So it's like a little vacuum that's left temporarily in the space behind where that rotor used to be a fraction of a second ago. And the bats then come flying through, and they're not getting hit by any rotor, but then they fly through this low pressure zone. And the pressure within their circulatory system, their blood pressure, is now so great compared to the outside air that their capillaries in their lungs burst. And they die eventually of internal bleeding. So there was one study in Alberta, Canada, that looked at this. And I believe, and don't quote me exactly on the numbers, but I believe it was approximately 50% of the animals that died at that wind farm had no evidence of trauma. So they had no broken bones, no bruises, no gashes. 50% of them died strictly because of the decompression, because of the barotrauma. And about 50% of the rest had evidence of both barotrauma and decompression. So there's two different ways of dying for a bat. Barotrauma might actually be the more significant one. Bat mammalian respiratory systems are put together differently than avian respiratory systems. So they don't have this problem with barotrauma, but the bats do. Well, there's been approximately 12 species that have been documented underneath wind farms having been killed at turbines. There's probably more species that have not been documented yet, and there will be more species added to that list as wind farms start going into areas that they hadn't been in before, and areas within the ranges of different species. So for example, the endangered Indiana bat was just added to that list about a year and a half ago. Well, it's probably because in the previous time where those wind farms were going, most of them were not going within the range of that endangered species. But now they are coming into that range. And so we do know that Indiana bats can be affected. Anyway, hoary bats, red bats, and silver-haired bats, and if you remember, those are highly migratory tree bats. They're going to be flying south of the Ohio River Valley, really long distance. These are the cute guys. Red bat, as my students kid me all the time, but this is the most handsome mammal in the Great Lakes region. You have not lived until you have seen a male red bat up close. They're very, very beautiful with this brick red fur, and many of the hairs are tipped with white. They have a short snout instead of a longer dog-like or mouse-like ones. They have these nice rounded contoured ears. The wing membranes are a deep, deep black that contrast wonderfully with the red of the fur. They have little patches of white right by the wrist. That is the wrist. That's the thumb sticking up right there. Just a gorgeous animal. It is a solitary tree dweller, so you're not going to find it in a barn. It's all by itself, unless there's a mom and her young. The hoary bat, it's relatively uncommon around here, although I heard this morning that in one of the surveys being done, they did pick up a hoary bat. And we did pick it up when we were working here as well. It's the largest species in the Northeast, and in eastern Canada it weighs up to about 30 grams. So that's the largest species in most of this section of the continent. It too is a solitary tree-dwelling species like the red bat. And then we have the silver-haired bat. We caught one of these. I don't think it would be very abundant in this particular area in the summer, but it probably migrates through. Most of the silver-haired bats that we have in the state of Michigan are north of the soil change. So as you go north, you suddenly get sandier soils and you start getting more forest and less farmland. That's a big soil change that occurs. You're going from the deciduous forest biome into a transition to the coniferous forest biome. And 90% of all the silver-haired bats that I've ever caught in Michigan are north of that line. So it's a more northern species, but then they have to come back through this way to go south of the Ohio River Valley for hibernation. One of the things about mortality of bats that is pretty consistent when you look at various studies that have been done is that you have mortality becoming much more common in late summer. So we're talking about August and perhaps early September. Individual wind farms in different years, they might differ slightly, but it's going to be peaking in that general area in August, tailing off into September. Whether it starts in late July or the first week of August, you know, it's just going to depend. Now, there's some reasons that make sense as to why this is true, and for other reasons, we don't really understand this particular pattern. It does make sense to a certain degree in that you have our young bats who are born in June, they're subsisting on milk throughout July, and then by August, they're up and running on their own. So you have your largest populations of the year occurring in August. And so it's not too surprising that more bats are being killed. There's just more availability of them. Also in August, because the young have been raised, you start having natural movement of the bats from where they're going to spend the summer to where they're going to spend the winter. In other words, you have migration beginning and a lot of wandering activity. So again, you have another reason why more animals are going to be potentially coming into contact than with those rotor blades or hitting barotrauma. Anyway, that's a standard pattern. We see that all the time. Mortality also increases with the height of the turbine. So some of the smaller turbines around, like if you go up to Mackinac City, there's a couple of them there on the south side of the bridge. Even the ones near Traverse City are not very large. Ones that you know, a high school or something like that might put in aren't very large. But once you start getting into these mega structures that are 400 feet tall with 150-foot rotors, those things now are reaching 550 feet in the air. And what we think that what is happening is that that's finally getting into the airspace where the bats are typically traveling. So that if you kept them lower than that, we would probably have less mortality. But now that they're up to that size, we're killing a lot of bats. That happens to be the Harvest Wind Farm up near Pigeon in Huron County. And that's what used to be called the Noble Wind Park, also in Huron County, but they're expanding into Sand Lake. Another thing about bats and wind power is that mortality is greater, not maybe, is greater at low wind speeds. And this probably reflects bat biology. In other words, they do feed on insects. If it's very, very windy, insects are not going to be flying because they can't go against the wind. Also, our bats are very small. So if it's very windy, the bats are going to be buffeted and they may not even be able to go against the wind. So in your higher wind speeds, the bat activity is much lower, probably because insect activity and bat activity in general is low. But that's important later on when we come to a possible mitigation strategy.